The man in black was now the man behind bars. Johnny Cash, one of America's biggest country stars, was photographed in handcuffs on May 11, 1965, after what police called a night of chaos in Starkville, Mississippi. The official charge was trespassing and picking flowers from someone's garden. But the truth was far darker. Cash was spiraling into addiction, rage, and self-destruction. In that cold cement cell, alone and shaking, he pulled out a scrap of paper and wrote 4 lines that would become one of his most haunting songs. What happened in Starkville City Jail wasn't just an arrest. It was a warning of how close Johnny Cash was to losing everything. May 1965. Johnny Cash was at the peak of his career and the bottom of his life. His songs were topping the charts. Ring of Fire, I Walk the Line, Folsom Prison Blues. These weren't just hits. They were anthems that defined American country music. But behind the legend was a man crumbling under the weight of addiction, infidelity, and inner demons he couldn't escape. Cash was consuming nearly 100 amphetamine pills a day. The little white tablets kept him awake for days at a time, performing show after show, driving hundreds of miles between venues, never stopping, never resting. His first marriage to Vivian Liberto was disintegrating. His affair with June Carter was becoming public knowledge. His behavior was growing increasingly erratic and dangerous. That week in May, Cash was on a grueling tour through the South. He'd performed in Memphis, then Jackson, and was scheduled for another show in 2 days. But somewhere between the pills, the whiskey, and the pressure, Johnny Cash snapped. On the evening of May 11th, Cash arrived in Starkville, Mississippi, a small college town that would forever be etched into country music history. He checked into a local motel, but instead of resting, he started drinking and taking pills. More pills. By midnight, Cash was in a state that his friends would later describe as completely out of his mind. What happened next was witnessed by several residents of Starkville, though accounts vary depending on who's telling the story. What's certain is this. Around 2 in the morning, Johnny Cash was wandering through the residential streets of Starkville, high on amphetamines and drunk on whiskey, talking to himself and acting increasingly aggressive. A local police officer named Harold Hollingsworth spotted Cash stumbling through someone's front yard. The officer approached and asked Cash what he was doing. Cash's response, according to the police report, was hostile and incoherent. He claimed he was looking for a place to sleep and that he had every right to be there. Officer Hollingsworth, recognizing the famous singer despite his disheveled state, tried to reason with Cash and offered to drive him back to his motel. But Cash refused. In fact, he became combative. He told the officer to leave him alone, using language that the police report described as profane and threatening. What happened next escalated the situation from a potential misunderstanding to a criminal incident. As Officer Hollingsworth attempted to guide Cash toward the patrol car, the singer suddenly lashed out. He kicked the door of the police vehicle, denting it badly. Then he began shouting obscenities at the officer, waking up half the neighborhood. Hollingsworth had no choice but to arrest him. As he placed handcuffs on one of America's most famous musicians, Cash reportedly laughed and said something that would haunt him for years. "I've been singing about going to prison my whole life. Guess it's about time I saw what it's really like." Johnny Cash was driven to Starkville City Jail, a small facility that typically housed drunk college students and petty criminals. The booking officer, stunned to be processing someone famous, didn't quite know how to handle the situation. The official charges were listed as public drunkenness, trespassing, and destruction of city property. But there was one more charge added almost as a joke, one that would make headlines across America: picking flowers. Apparently, when Cash was found in that residential yard, he'd been pulling flowers from someone's garden. Whether he was actually trying to pick them as a gift for June Carter, as some romantic versions of the story claim, or whether he was simply too intoxicated to know what he was doing, nobody knows for certain. But that flower-picking charge became the detail that newspapers seized upon. "Country star arrested for flower theft," read one headline. Johnny Cash jailed in Mississippi Garden incident. Read another. The absurdity of the charge made it national news, but it also masked the very real crisis that was unfolding in Cash's life. Inside Starkville City Jail, Cash was placed in cell number 2, a small concrete room with a thin mattress, a metal toilet, and nothing else. The high from the amphetamines was wearing off and Cash was beginning to crash. Amphetamine withdrawal is brutal. It brings shaking, paranoia, depression, and a crushing fatigue that makes every minute feel like an hour. Cash sat on that thin mattress and looked around the cell. For years, he'd been singing about prisons. Folsom Prison Blues was one of his biggest hits. He'd performed at prisons, sympathized with inmates, built his whole image around being an outlaw and understanding the criminal mind. But he'd always been on the outside looking in, the free man who could walk away after the show. Now he was inmate number 1234. Now he was the one behind bars. And it terrified him. In interviews years later, Cash would describe that night in Starkville City Jail as one of the darkest moments of his life. Not because of the arrest itself, but because of what it represented. He saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, what he was becoming. He was destroying his marriage, alienating his children, ruining his health, and throwing away the career he'd worked so hard to build. In that cell, alone in the darkness, coming down from his high and shaking with withdrawal, Johnny Cash had what he would later call a moment of terrible clarity. He realized he had a choice to make. He could continue on this path of self-destruction, or he could change. He could keep taking pills until they killed him, or he could get clean. He could lose everything, or he could fight to save what mattered. Cash reached into his pocket and found a pencil stub that somehow hadn't been confiscated during booking. He looked around for something to write on and found a scrap of paper on the floor. Some accounts say it was the back of a cigarette pack. Others say it was a torn piece of a brown paper bag. Whatever it was, Cash began writing. The song that emerged was called Starkville City Jail. It was unlike anything Cash had written before. There was no romanticizing of prison life, no outlaw bravado, no tough guy posturing. It was raw, honest, and painful. Captured exactly what it felt like to be sitting in that cell, realizing you'd hit bottom. The lyrics were simple but devastating. Cash wrote about the concrete walls, the loneliness, the shame of being arrested in a strange town far from home. He wrote about the officer who arrested him, about kicking the police car, about the flowers that got him thrown in jail. But most powerfully, he wrote about the feeling of being trapped, not just by the cell but by his own choices. Starkville City Jail was never meant to be a hit song. It was never meant to be performed on stage or played on the radio. It was a document of a man at his lowest point, written in a moment of desperate honesty that most people never share with anyone. Cash was released from Starkville City Jail the next morning after paying a fine. The charges were eventually dropped, partly because Cash was famous and partly because the whole incident was more sad than criminal. But the damage was done. News of the arrest spread quickly. His record label was furious. His manager threatened to drop him. Vivian filed for divorce shortly afterward, citing this incident as further evidence of Cash's inability to be a responsible husband and father. But something else happened after Starkville. Something unexpected. Johnny Cash began to change. The arrest, humiliating as it was, served as a wake-up call. It wasn't an instant transformation. Cash would struggle with addiction for several more years. But Starkville marked the beginning of his journey toward redemption. Cash started attending church more regularly. He leaned on June Carter, who refused to marry him until he got clean. He began cutting back on the pills, though the process was agonizing. Most importantly, he started being honest about his struggles instead of hiding them behind the outlaw image. In 1968, 3 years after the Starkville arrest, Johnny Cash performed his legendary concert at Folsom Prison. The live album became one of his biggest commercial successes and revitalized his career. And there, in front of inmates who understood what it meant to be behind bars, Cash performed Starkville City Jail for one of the few times in his career. The inmates loved it. Not because it was catchy or clever, but because it was real. They recognized in Cash's words their own experiences of shame, regret, and the desperate hope for redemption. When Cash sang about sitting in that cell in Mississippi, every man in Folsom Prison knew exactly what he was feeling. Cash rarely performed Starkville City Jail after that. It was too personal, too painful. Unlike his other prison songs, which had a certain distance and storytelling quality, this one was autobiography. It was a scar he'd rather not display. But the song lived on in bootleg recordings and among hardcore Cash fans who recognized it as one of his most authentic pieces of work. Music critics who heard it described it as one of the most honest depictions of rock bottom ever recorded. There was no redemption arc in the song. No happy ending. Just the raw truth of a man sitting in a cell realizing he'd screwed up his life. The town of Starkville, Mississippi eventually embraced its connection to Johnny Cash. The old city jail where Cash spent that night still stands, though it's no longer in use. Cell number 2 has become something of a pilgrimage site for Cash fans. In later years, the town erected a marker commemorating the arrest, turning what was once an embarrassment into a piece of music history. Johnny Cash married June Carter in 1968 after finally getting clean. He credited her with saving his life, but he also gave credit to that night in Starkville. "That was the night I saw where I was headed," he said in a 1975 interview. "I was headed toward an early grave, and that jail cell showed me clear as day what my life had become." Cash remained sober for most of the rest of his life, though he had occasional relapses. He became an advocate for prison reform and continued performing at correctional facilities throughout his career. He never forgot what it felt like to be on the other side of those bars, even if just for one night. The Starkville arrest became a turning point in the Johnny Cash mythology. It was the moment when the man in black really did walk the line between destruction and redemption, and chose redemption. It proved that his prison songs weren't just performances. He'd actually experienced, even briefly, what it meant to lose your freedom because of your own poor choices. Decades later, when Cash was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he mentioned Starkville in his acceptance speech. "That night taught me that there's a difference between singing about trouble and living in it," he said. "I've been singing about prisons for years, but one night in a Mississippi jail taught me more than all those songs ever did." Johnny Cash died in 2003, just months after June Carter passed away. Among his personal effects found at his home was a framed piece of paper. It was the original scrap on which he'd written Starkville City Jail in that cell in 1965. He'd kept it for nearly 40 years, a reminder of the night he almost lost everything and made the choice to change. The story of Johnny Cash and Starkville City Jail reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments become our turning points. Sometimes we have to hit bottom before we can start climbing back up. And sometimes the most honest art comes from the most painful experiences. Cash never tried to hide or deny the Starkville arrest. In his autobiography, he wrote about it openly, describing his addiction and erratic behavior with brutal honesty. He wasn't proud of what happened, but he wasn't ashamed to admit it either. It was part of his story, part of his journey from self-destruction to redemption. For fans who love the outlaw image of Johnny Cash, Starkville is the moment that made it real. This wasn't a manufactured bad boy persona. This was a man who actually struggled, actually fell, actually sat in a jail cell wondering if he'd thrown his life away. And then he got up, got clean, and created some of the most powerful music in American history. If this incredible story of redemption and second chances moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to change your life. Have you ever had a moment that forced you to confront your own choices and decide to change? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about music's greatest legends and the moments that define them.